Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the AAHOA Educational Experience. This week, we're talking about debt, the economy, and what can be done when you find yourself in a little bit of economic trouble in your property and who to turn to for help. Joining me this week, Lawrence Lloyd, who is Managing Director with Delta Capital Group, and Brad Mead, who is the President of Delta Capital Group. And gentlemen, last week we talked about the economy. We seem to have hit another rough spot, so to speak. I think the economists in the White House call it a rough patch. It's a large patch. And we talked about the fact this may continue for some time. So for the hotel owner or the small business owner or just the general employee who's thinking, we're going to ride this thing out and I know I'm going through a tough time now, but things are certainly going to get better, so I really don't need to make any changes. That's probably not the case. If you're feeling that you're in a tough spot now, it may be a good time to turn for help.
Sure, and it depends on the circumstance. So let's paint a scenario. You have a hotel operator owns 1, 2, maybe 3 hotels. Maybe they're limited service. They're away from known demand generators, and all of a sudden he looks at his revenue stream, which was pretty healthy 3-4 years ago, and it's starting to evaporate. Or even it's down 20%, and it's just reached the tipping point where it's difficult to make all the ends meet. So that typical Asian American hotelier would start to cut expenses, and has done a marvelous job of doing that, and ends up working the front desk and changing sheets and doing all the things that are necessary to keep the hotel running, and do that to reduce the cost of paying other people to do that. All of a sudden he gets to the point where now maybe he can't pay his real estate tax. He's looking at his large mortgage payment and says, I'm not producing the cash flow to pay all those things. And that, I think, is where we can help and often have help. So Brad, help me a little bit with some commentary on where we would go from here.
Part of the challenge in today's market is that near the end of the 2000s, we got into an overbuilding campaign in the hotel industry, and we started bringing on rooms left and right. And banks were complicit in that because they were willing to lend as much money as you needed. So there was an explosion of hotel rooms. And when the music stopped, long about September 2008, there was still a chain of hotel rooms that was going to be dumped onto the market, and that occurred for the next 2 years. And the problem with a hotel room is that it's a form of inventory that doesn't go away once it's built. It's there for 50 years. And so unlike car inventory, when you have too many cars, you stop making them for a little while and you eventually bring the inventory in the line again. It doesn't happen in the hotel industry. And at the same time, there were trends going on in the overall commercial industry that caused companies to do more conference calls, more video calls, and traveling became nowhere near as much fun, and certainly a lot of a hassle. And technology allowed us to communicate in lots of ways without actually being there. So that meant a lot of hotel room nights were coming down. One of the major corporations in Europe, a major German corporation, used to spend upwards of $400 million a year just on hotel rooms. And they've cut that down to about $20 million a year, and they're doing everything by video conferencing. So that's a trend that is going to be hard on hotel owners. At the same time, all sorts of websites have come up, third-party websites have come up, where the public now understands that they can get a deal on a hotel room, and they're getting smarter, and they're learning how to get a 50% off deal or some internet rate deal that allows them to bring the average daily rate of a hotel way down. And this is hurting hotel operators. At the same time, you have the overlying recession. And since the hotel rooms aren't going to come into balance because they're not going to go away, then you're in for a long haul. And what we're saying to hotel operators is, if you are not making money in today's market, if you're not paying all your bills, and most importantly, paying yourself, because what happens with AAHOA members is they tend to work without pay if that's what they have to do to keep the bills paid. If you're not paying all the bills and paying yourself, then it's time to restructure your debt. Take it on, take it head on. If you're waiting for the economy to come back like 2007, it's not going to happen. And so what you really need to do is look at your hotel and say, what do I need to do strategically to cut that debt sometimes as much as in half in order to be able to survive and make money. If I can make money today in today's market, then whatever happens going forward, I can probably live with that.
And let's, before you get into actually taking those steps, what are the signs that you need to begin taking those steps? Because we hear of so many people who, unfortunately, they go out and they exhaust all their friends, their relatives, and they do everything in their power to pay those bills, thinking and hoping that they're going to see light at the end of the tunnel, not recognizing that we may have arrived at a new norm, and going out and exhausting all your resources, all your backup resources, is probably not a good idea. That maybe you want to, when you first see the signs, begin looking at restructuring debt. So what are those signs?
Well, it's a simple tool. It's a cash flow statement. And this is something that you have to start to look at quarters ahead of time to plan for cash flow. Although it's after 2008 it was a little more difficult to track revenue because we started to go into a recession and revenue started to contract a bit. So that's the tool, is cash flow planning. Do I have enough to pay the real estate tax? Do I have enough to pay the mortgage? And then you need to begin to prioritize the things that are paid, and you have to keep in mind that you need to pay the things that keep the hotel open, which would include utilities, any of those franchise fees that are required to be paid to make sure that your phone system or your internet site is not turned off. So that begins the problem when you start to have to prioritize what can be paid and when. Probably a little bit too late then, but if you're managing your cash flow statement, you should know when that's coming.
So if you're going 3 months without any pay,
that's it.
You're
there.
That's
you're,
not a good
you're
sign.
beyond there.
Yeah.
If you're not paying your bills on a monthly basis, think back to what you were doing in 2007. If you were paying all your bills on a regular basis in 2007, and all of a sudden that stopped, and you're behind in your real estate taxes, and you're extending out payment to your vendors, and you're telling your front desk they're not getting paid because your front desk is a family member and you can do that, then you're already beyond the moment where you need to address the issue of your debt. Because once you've cut all the expenses, and I can tell you, AAHOA members are fabulous at cutting expenses to the bone. They're living on rice and beans by the time that they've cut everything down. And if you're still not able to make the debt payment, then you've got two choices. You can live for a long, long time in the self-created prison. Or, and by the way, prisoners live better. They get better meals and they have time off and they get some sleep, okay? And we call it the Patel prison. Are you in a Patel prison? And if you are there, then there's no risk in saying, okay, what do I have to do to put a clean piece of paper on the table and say, let's relook at this. What do I have to do to make it work? Because if it doesn't work, then give it back to the bank. Give it back to the bank and go off and get a job working at somebody else's hotel where they'll have to pay you because that's the labor laws.
So you have this situation where you're struggling to make your monthly payments, and you've got that debt out there, but you're not late. You haven't, or maybe you are late, but you haven't received any notices from the bank that they're going to foreclose on you. But you know in the back of your mind that you're just treading water and it's probably not going to get any better. What do you do? I mean, who do you contact? Do you just walk into your bank and say, hey, banker, I'm here, I want to restructure a new loan? Because it would seem to me that I wouldn't walk into my auto repair shop and say, let me borrow your wrench and start working on my car. I think you have to employ some experts or some people that can say, hey, we've been there, we've done that before.
Sure. Well, absent of having that expert in your pocket when you go in to see your banker, it does make sense to address the banker and say, look, I have a problem. And if you don't have any expert advice at that moment, you say, I'm not sure what the solution is. I just want to let you know that I'm having some cash flow problems. I paid most of my bills. I haven't paid the real estate tax. The bank's going to want to know that if you're not escrowing into a payment plan with the bank, and a conversation ensues from there. But you wouldn't go see. It's not something where you need the lawyer yet because it's not a legal problem. It's an economic problem. And if you get the right kind of advice, you can enter into a consensual conversation with the bank and maybe move towards a restructure if that's what makes sense for both parties.
Well, and when we come back after the break, I want to talk about that. What are the realities in the banking world? Because oftentimes we as small business owners just see it from our perspective. And there's somebody sitting on the other end of the table that's got a lot of money invested here too, and we got to understand their perspective if we're going to make a realistic deal. So
Sure.
We'll talk about that coming up after the break. You're watching the AAHOA Educational Experience. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to the AAHOA Educational Experience. I'm Chip Rogers. Thanks for joining us this week. We are now talking about restructuring your debt. What is possible? With me this week, Lawrence Lloyd, who is Managing Director with Delta Capital Group, and Brad Mead, who is the President of Delta Capital Group. Again, gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. So you're in a position where you've finally recognized that something needs to be done. You're struggling to pay your bills, and you understand that there's no way you can continue to service this mortgage at its current amount. You don't want to walk into the bank necessarily and hand over the keys, but now you're in a position where you think maybe I can go to my bank and restructure something. So you walk in, you've signed a note saying this is how much I'm going to pay you back. The bank is on the other side. Give us the perspective of the bank, and I want to start with you, Brad. Mm-hmm. They don't want you to hand over the keys because they're not hotel operators. They don't want a hotel in their portfolio. So there is a reason for them to work with you.
Well, there are a lot of reasons for them to work. First of all, their goal is to stay employed. That's a different goal than you as a hotel owner have. Your goal is to stay above water. But the people that you're talking to at the bank are bank employees. Whatever they do with you, as long as they do it according to a process that's sanctioned by the bank and by the regulators, they're liable to keep their job. That's a very important statement, because when you go into the bank and you say, look, I don't have the ability to pay my bank payment going forward. We're coming into low season. I've got a situation coming up. I'm just telling you ahead of time I'm going to have to stop making the payment. They're going to say to you, continue to make your payment. We'll work with you. And they'll continue to say that, and they'll say lots of things like, well, as long as you're current, we can talk about a restructure. The reality is that you're going to need to go 90 days in arrears, and there's a technical reason for that. Once you go 91 days without paying according to the original terms of the note, the bank is forced to put the loan on non-accrual. That says that they can no longer book any interest or any interest rate spread between what you pay and what the bank borrows from its depositors and pays them. Banks get money from depositors, they pay them a little bit of interest, they then lend it out to you at a higher rate of interest, and they make the spread. Well, at 91 days they can no longer do that because the FDIC says you can no longer do that. So the bank now has a red flagged loan, and when the auditors come in every quarter, they say, well, show us your pile of red flagged loans. You want to be a red flagged loan if you're going to go through the restructure process. And what that automatically causes the bank to do is to take a lot of notice at the board level of what's going on with this loan and what are we doing to fix it. And it's at that point that you can propose a lot of different solutions. Some of these solutions include techniques where the loan is split in half into a Part A and a Part B. The Part A is what you can afford, the Part B is what you can't afford. When Lawrence talked before about cash flow, what you do when you get into trouble with a property is you solve the equation in reverse. You say, what is my cash flow? What is this property producing, and how much is available to pay debt service? And that, frankly, is how much the property is able to afford. And so if you used to pay $300,000 a year in debt service and you can only pay $100,000 a year in debt service, then your loan needs to come down by 2/3. And there are a series of techniques that the banks are allowed to perform that are encouraged by the FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, but they obviously don't advertise them because they're not interested in having everybody come in and say, hey, what a great idea, why don't we lower our bank debt? And what we do is take borrowers through all those different policies and procedures so that the banker at the end of the day can have a place where he has a loan that qualifies for what he needs to do and that he's met a process whereby he keeps his job. Again, I reiterate, the banker's interested in keeping his job. You as the hotel owner are interested in keeping your hotel. But those are two different things. If a banker's still employed Friday afternoon, he's very happy. If you're making payroll Friday afternoon, you're very happy as a hotel owner. So it's a very different set of goals, and as long as you can mesh them together, you've got an opportunity to work it out.
There's another piece to this too I'd like to add, and the process works in a similar fashion with the SBA, U.S. Treasury. Often we'll see a hotel owner has a first loan with a bank, and then in second position has an SBA loan. If they can afford to pay the first loan and can't pay the SBA loan, there is another process that we can go through with the loan administrator for the SBA, and then eventually that loan gets transferred to Workout in the SBA, which is down in Little Rock, Arkansas. And we're able to work to compromise that loan where it actually either is put aside for the moment or completely forgiven depending on the circumstances of the property.
How important is it for a property owner to be realistic about what they can actually afford? I would imagine you run into these cases where people will say, well, I was paying $300,000 a year. The numbers actually say you can only pay $100,000, but they want to think that things are going to get better and they can pay at least $200,000. It would seem to me that on both sides of the table, it's really important for the property owner to be honest and realistic about what they can do going forward, because what you're going through now and restructuring something is not something you want to have to go through again.
Yeah. Well, we're back to the issue of cash flow. It's looking at the numbers and saying there's $100,000 of cash flow available to pay debt service. We know banks use a number where cash flow has to fit a time multiple coverage, and that's a metric that the bank will be looking at. And it's also possible to stage this. If you were paying $300,000, you can now afford $100,000, and you're concerned that you signed, for this money and want to give it back. You can say you can put a provision in this modification that allows you to incrementally start to pay more if that cash flow is available.
Part of the problem entrepreneurs have is they're optimists. You don't become an entrepreneur unless you got a whole lot of hope that you're going to be able to pull off what you're trying to pull off. And even when times are bad, the optimism is still the thing that gets you through the night and gets you through the day. And your point is exactly right. When you go in to do Workout, you want to take a very conservative position, and you want to say, look, I don't think the economy next year is going to be any better than it was this year. It might even be worse. And you've got to set your parameters so that whatever happens, you only do this once. Now, you're going to have to make that argument with the bank. And the banker has a DNA that works to your benefit here. If you've ever gone into a banker and you've ever said, I'm sure, Mr. Banker, that I'm going to hit these forecasts, he's always trying to talk you down. If you go into a banker and give him forecasts that he's unbelieving of, that they're going to be that low, he won't try and talk you up. He's not built to do that. There's no optimism in a banker. He spent his whole life bringing down forecasts to what he says are realistic levels. If you go down and bring him a forecast that's below his expectation, he will not try and walk you back up. And it's a judo maneuver that works very well. And it's to everybody's advantage, because if the banker agrees to a lower conservative forecast and you exceed it, everybody's happy. So the answer is exactly to your point, Chip. You want to be very conservative in how you put these forecasts together, and you want to not assume that the economy is ever going to get better.
Very good point. Well, we've covered a lot in this particular show, and next week we're going to continue to talk about restructuring and what is possible for you, the property owner, and what the bank has as an expectation, and are there answers for what seems to be an unanswerable problem sometimes. But for this week, we are out of time. So for Brad Mead, President of Delta Capital, and Lawrence Lloyd, Managing Director, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us.
Thank you.
I'm Chip Rogers, and of course, you can reach me, chip@AAHOA.com. That's my email, chip@AAHOA.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week.